What's going on, everybody? Here we are on a Monday, back at it, starting off the week. And what's a better way to start off the week than with a question that I ask all of you to get people's input on. Now, we go through this hobby and we all live in our different spots all over the country, and we're kind of little isolated dots on a map. And the great thing about social media, about YouTube, about Facebook, about some of these things is the ability to network and communicate with people that you otherwise wouldn't have met. The number of friends that I've met, the number of, fellow collectors that I've met because of YouTube is insane. It's amazing. It makes going places so much more fun because the likelihood of somebody that I know that I've met is going to be there and we can talk cards. And so it went from this hobby of isolation to this hobby of connectedness, all because we're using these tools that have been developed for our hobby and for our enjoyment, which is awesome. Now, one of my favorite things to do is I have these questions and, well, what do other people think about this? Am I the only person who feels this way? And a lot of the videos that I've produced over the last 22 months or so since I launched my channel have been videos where I asked a question because I'm genuinely interested in what everyone has to say. And that's what these Monday videos are. And so this last week, I asked everyone, how does eye appeal versus the grade on a card, the assigned grade from the grading company, how do those things go together for you? Does the grade on the card matter more to you than it did 3 years ago? Does it matter less than it did 3 years ago? What about in the future? Will it matter more? Will it matter less? And now some of us who have our opinions, some people are like, oh, way less. And we can't even imagine that somebody else would feel differently. And conversely, there are people who care way more now about the grade than they did 3 years ago. And they don't understand how somebody could feel the opposite of them. And yes, believe it or not, there were some polarizing opinions in both directions in this last week's question. And then there were some people with some hybrid approaches. So I thought it was fascinating to hear what everybody else had to say. Because again, I think that if we have our opinions, which we've formed, and we don't at least hear other people's perspectives, sometimes we don't realize that maybe there's a middle ground between what we thought we felt and what we actually end up feeling. So getting input is great. And we have built this huge, awesome community of collectors, so why not figure out what everyone else has to say? So that's what we did. And there were questions and answers from all over the place. So let's go ahead and first start and looking at the people who said that grading and the numbers on the slabs matter less than they ever have, and why. And we'll start off with a response from my dad. Check it out.
Regarding the owning of high-grade cards, for me, ended like 12 years ago. I had very high-graded cards in the hundreds. At that point, I decided I just wanted to have nice eye appeal cards and sold the really high-end examples I had in the past. Having done that, I had funds to buy a lot of nice cards from those years and others. My collection has gone to older examples of the players I value most. The future regarding card values has already begun to change. Centered cards are at a premium as we speak. I see cards that are centered sell for more, in many cases, than higher graded cards that are not centered. Eye appeal is at an all-time high. I used to be a pack fresh card was the most desired card. That seems, in my honest opinion, to be changing. Another comment says, assigned grades are less important now than 3 years ago, as it's an ongoing racket where customers are to believe that the card grading companies are the premier, be-all and end-all, and all when it comes to grading. Starting at the ground floor with their expert examiners on the case Never mind all their staff's young, fresh faces that have us believe they're grading experts when they most are barely 20 years old. And I wish I could just leave it there. But the upper management feels a need to control the market on card values, i.e., Ricky Henderson rookie cards come to mind. The CEO being too cozy with close friends of the hobby, and of course, lest we forget that there's still an ongoing investigation with PSA via the FBI. Need I say more about the twosome grading companies, SGC PSA, being owned by the same umbrella company, isn't cause for suspicion. Why would I put much trust in them now versus 3 years ago? And a third and final comment from my friend Dave says, another great episode, Greg. The key question to answer is whether beauty is in the eyes of the beholder or is it in the eyes of the holder? As a vintage collector, the grade definitely means less to me than it did 3 years ago and will probably continue in that direction for the future. The reason for this is that many times the grade does not reflect the centering. I have viewed many cards graded a 7 or an 8 that are not centered. So for me, a minimum grade is a necessary but not sufficient reason to buy a card. It has to meet a minimum grade but also be centered. Sometimes I will make an exception for a rare vintage card that seldom appears in the marketplace, like a 1915 Cracker Jack. Generally, SGC does a better job than PSA of reflecting the centering in their assessment.
Okay, so there's so much to unpack there. 3 responses in favor of the grades mattering less than before. Now, there were more than that. There were several more than that. But I try to pick 2 or 3 that kind of represent the variety of responses. And that's what these 3 did. And some of the things that were said here are differing reasoning with the same opinion of that the grade matters less. Now, it doesn't mean that the grades are completely irrelevant. It doesn't mean that the grades are wrong even. It might just mean that their influence on what we want to spend our money on has changed. So if we look at these, there are these 3 responses. There was some of the things that are mentioned to me are really interesting because they're so different. So the middle response talks about, well, the grading companies are out to lunch. The grading companies are doing whatever they want. When it comes to a grade, it is sometimes about who you know that gets you the grade instead of what the card actually looks like. Now, I don't know about all of the connections that people have. I try to stay out of that piece of it. But I will say that more than ever, I think more people are agreeing that some of the grades that come back don't seem to make sense. And we've seen videos that other YouTube channels have done that show a card. They say, how did it get this grade? And then they send it to a different company and it gets a completely different grade. And when that happens, you have to say, who's wrong? If this card got a 3 and it looks like a 6 to me, and then I crack it and I send it to a different company and it gets a 6, or even more than that, what if the card gets an altered, a color added or trimmed, and they crack it and they send it in and it gets a 6? Is the company that said it was trimmed wrong, or is the company that said it was a 6 wrong? And then what it does is it makes us go, I don't even know what to believe anymore. And there are times that's where I fall. I don't know what to believe anymore. If a card got trimmed by one company and got a 6 from a different company, which those videos are out there, that is happening right now. Or a card gets a 3 and then you crack it and you send it back in and it gets a 5. Those with the same company. It's hard to know what to believe, but all of that being shared with the collecting community makes us at least have to take a step back and think, what's real what's right, what's happening, what is going on. Now, I'll continue to say, I think for the large majority of the time, the grading companies do a decent job. They rarely will miss a crease. They rarely will have a card that gets a 3 that should get a 9, you know? But what they do is they are able to give us a range. And that's where I'm at, is it gives me a range. The 7 doesn't mean a 7. It means it's pretty nice if it's a vintage card. It means it's a 6, 7, or 8, somewhere in there. But there's no doubt that the discrepancies that happen with the grading companies and the lack of consistency at times, even if that's just a little bit of the time and not most of the time, it makes us all kind of question and wonder, what's the validity of all of this? I get that. Now, have I personally gotten to the point where I think the grading companies are out the window? No, I don't. I do think that they offer a service that has some value. And I think that the grading companies make some mistakes, just like I make mistakes. You know, I'll have a student, I'll have 40 papers turned in second period, and every once in a while, one of them doesn't end up in the grade book. Why does it not end up in the grade book? Maybe the paper stuck together. Maybe I missed it. Maybe I entered it in wrong. Maybe I got a call in the middle of it and I skipped it. I do make mistakes. There is human error that exists, and there has to be a certain level of forgiveness for human error, because none of us, at least walking the earth right now, are perfect. So mistakes are going to happen. Does that mean that the whole grading thing is out the window? Not necessarily, but maybe. I guess it depends on what is acceptable and not acceptable to each individual. Now, the last comment I think makes a great point. A great point. My buddy Dave says something that I think is really important for us all to consider. And that's, well, it kind of depends on what it is. He said, I like high grade cards, but I also like centered cards. So if a card is a high grade, but it's off center, may not be a card that I want. But if it's a rare card, if it's a 1915 Cracker Jack, he says, and it's more off center than he would usually be okay with, he might have to go for it because that card doesn't come up very often. I think that's a big piece of this, and I'm going to get into that more with some of the comments that are coming up here in a few minutes. But if we're talking about a vintage card might have a technical grade that doesn't suit our eye. It doesn't look good to our eye, but technically it's right. It has some surface damage. It maybe has a little wrinkle on the back. It maybe has a touch on some of the edges. But when we look at the card, it looks gorgeous to us. So when that happens, we have to consider, what is the likelihood of one coming up again? I mean, if you want a high grade, a 7 or an 8, Cracker Jack Christy Mathewson card, how many of those are even in existence? When I bought recently my Blackbeard Pirate card that I talked about on Saturday, just a couple of days ago, anyone that shows up is good to me. The grade almost didn't matter at all. When I saw one available in a 2, and PSA is only graded 22 of them, the fact that it was just a 2, the fact that it had some paste on the back, that didn't bother me at all, because it just doesn't show up very often. And it had a pretty nice image on it, so I was good to go. But if we're talking about a 2010 card that has been cut with new manufacturing processes and a much higher quality of cardboard, you might be a little bit more picky. If it's a card that is available for sale all the time, you could go on eBay right now and say, I want a 1983 Topps Tony Gwynn. And there will be tons of them to choose from. But if you type in that 1915 Cracker Jack Christy Mathewson, there might be 1, 2, or even 0. So sometimes you have to change your threshold of what matters to you, how much the grade matters, how much the quality of the card even matters, depending on the rarity of the card. Now, the other comment was the one from my dad about how his opinion has changed. He went from, he wanted a pack fresh card. If it was OC, no problem. If it had some print marks on it, no problem. And as he has gone through his collecting, he has changed his opinion more to, I want a card that looks good, not a card that looks like it came out of a pack. If when it came out of a pack, it had some flaws. I get that too. There are going to be changes in preferences in the hobby. And it's something that we always need to be kind of aware of. Because if severely off center suddenly didn't seem to matter to most people, you can get a card with an OC qualifier on it right now on eBay for pennies on the dollar compared to the centered copy of the card without the qualifier. So there's no doubt about it that the trends that change will continue to change. And what changes them, sometimes we don't know why they change, but they change. And it does seem, it's kind of hard to dispute, that right now, the cards that have the best centering in the same grade are selling at a significant premium. Will that continue? Maybe, maybe not. Now, there were people who said that the grade matters more than it's ever meant. Now, there were not a ton of responses like that, but there were some. And at first I was like, really? But then I read their explanation. I'm like, oh yeah, that does make sense. It does make sense. It is something to consider. So let's take a look at a couple of those responses.
The first comment says, assign grades on a slab is more important to me now than a few years ago. Why? Because I like buying autograph cards and there are so many forgeries out there. At least I have the peace of mind that PSA graded a card, has gone through the process, and I have taken the guessing out of whether or not it's real. My problem with graded cards is the price. I have a complete 1991 Topps Desert Shield set that I would love to grade, as I was there and I know I have a ton of PSA 10 cards. But it would cost me $10,000 plus just to have them graded. Will it matter more? I think it will matter more, but I'm hopeful that the card companies start grading them themselves out of the print shop. The second comment says, when it comes to grading and numerical values, it matters to Collector's Universe, PSA and SGC, CGC, Beckett, and potentially Fanatics in the future. They want us to buy their slabs. Then assigned grades matter for a lot of card dealers like Chris Sewell, who's doing it for their job and career. Assigned grade also carries a premium in modern and especially ultra-modern. For those that are flipping cards at the same card show or the next show, then there's the PSA set registry guys and gals, which is for all of the high rollers. Pre-war, vintage, modern, and ultra-modern too. Then there's the auction houses, which focus on high-end cards. What we need to be concerned about is the amount of cards that have been trimmed and altered that have been assigned grades. Whether it's the graders making those flaws, not having the technology to detect the flaws, it's hard to say. But honestly, I wouldn't say graded cards equates to peace of mind, but rather the illusion that we think it does. How many cards do you think Kurt's Card Care has been restored from the dead? I don't really do anything special or unique when it comes to buying cards. I tend to be conservative. However, with my money, and I don't like spending above my means. So if anything, I probably could afford to spend more, if that makes any sense. However, it is clear to me now that watching YouTube that I should have made a stronger argument with both my teachers and parents too, that not only my B's looked like A's, My C's definitely looked like A's too. Hope your students are watching, though. They can use the force of eye appeal like an army of Luke Skywalkers. Have an amazing school year and watch out for the lightsabers.
Okay, couple of good responses there, right? I mean, number one, the grading companies, it there's no doubt about it that it feels like autographs on cards have gained popularity over the last few years, and I think that is a reaction to autographs on modern cards being sought after, right? I mean, if you can open a pack and you can get a Joe Burrow autograph on a card, it normalizes autographs being on cards. And if it's the hit, if it's the sought after card, then it kind of changes what everybody's opinion is of autographs on cards. Because remember, I remember as a kid going to shows, as a teenager going to shows and seeing cards autographed and just like, what are you doing? Why would you do that? You'd only do that to a low value card. Now, did I get cards autographed as a kid? I did. But they were almost always TTM. There were a couple of times I got autographs of some Hall of Fame type players like Willie McCovey. I got a Willie McCovey autograph at a show, but I didn't get one of his good cards. I got one of his last cards autographed because I didn't want to ruin one of his good cards. But since that has changed in the hobby and the whole perception of autographs has changed, it definitely has made autographs on cards normal, and it has made it that much more important that the people who are determining whether or not it's an authentic autograph and who you use to verify that it's an authentic autograph has become more important than ever. And I've always been kind of a skeptic, right? And it's probably because of when I grew up and how I grew up and the cards that were signed and not being done at the time. I'm kind of skeptical about autographs that I don't personally witness being signed, at least vintage ones. But here's the thing I always go back to. When PSA authenticates an autograph, if somebody can prove that it's fake, that could do major damage to PSA, right? They've got a lot to lose by authenticating an autograph that's not authentic. They don't have a lot to gain, but they have a lot to lose. Imagine if a YouTuber got really good at a Roger Maris autograph and said, hey, let's do an experiment. Let's see if I could get him. And they sign the card, and they say, well, send it in. They send it in. Let's see if we can get him. And they get him, and they authenticate something that's fake. Think about the damage that would do to PSA. So what am I talking about? What I'm talking about is because they have so much to lose by authenticating an autograph, I think they're going to have to be really darn sure to authenticate something. Now, does that make mistake? Do they make mistakes? Of course. Again, back to the human error I was just talking about. I tell my students all the time, you're allowed to make mistakes. That's why 90% is an A. I don't make 100% an A because nobody would get an A. You're allowed to make some mistakes and still be really good. There are going to be some mistakes, but the amount that they have to lose is massive. And so when we're talking about autograph authentication, I think that you are in a much better likelihood of buying an authentic autograph if it has been slabbed by a company like PSA than if it has not been authenticated by anyone and it just looks real to you. So I totally get that perspective. The other perspective that Andrew says I think is interesting as well. I mean, he goes in, and I have it printed out right here because when I just read it, he goes into talking about something that I think we sometimes forget. rarity and supply is a huge piece of value of anything, right? The reason that oceanfront property is valuable is because it's rare and there's only so much of it. The reason that land in, the middle of the, country is not as valuable is because it's more plentiful compared to the population. So that makes sense. So one of the ways that PSA, they got their hooks into us years ago is the POP report. The POP report was a game changer. The reason we cared about grades so much is we go, oh, this one's an 8. There's only 3 that have ever been graded higher. This is the 4th best one in the world. And that really got us. And then the set registry, the competition of who's got a better collection, who's got nicer cards, who's got the best 1956 set. Well, there was finally a way to be able to, quote unquote, compete. The set registry and the POP report were 2 of the best marketing moves in the history of card grading, right? It's amazing what those have done. And it's true. When you go to buy a rare card and you look up the POP report and you see none higher, you're like, this is the best one in the world. Now, is it really the best one in the world? Or is it just the one that received the best grade in the world? That's a different story, maybe. Or maybe it's not. But those are things that got us to buy into the grades. How do you dispute that it's not the best one in the world when it's got the highest grade of anyone in the world? They got their hooks in early. They set that hook deep. And then it's been a slow battle trying to say, well, maybe. And I think that's where maybe we've gotten is now we don't look at the number as the be all and end all. And part of that, I think, is a result of some of the human error that has been exposed via Instagram, via, Facebook, via YouTube. It's changed our perspective and we say, oh yeah, they make mistakes. Before, you'd crack a card and send it in and get a different grade and you knew about it, but nobody else did. Now, thousands of people could become aware of it. I think that's a really interesting point. I also think something that's interesting is it might depend, kind of back to Dave's point earlier. Whether the grade matters or not largely might depend on what the card is. There was another category of responses that said it depends. Maybe this, or maybe it's this and this. So let's take a look at those here.
As for your question for next week, here's my take. I think for more modern cards, the grade matters more now than 3 years ago, since it's all about that PSA 10. It is the rage for the younger collector, and in 3 years, that will still be the case, and possibly even more so. Look at how much more a PSA 10 goes for compared to a PSA 9, for instance. It is sometimes 10 times more expensive. For vintage cards, I think the grade is not as important as it was 3 years ago, since the eye appeal and centering have taken off as more important than the grade. It is sometimes obvious that a vintage PSA 3 is a nicer card than a PSA 4 due to the eye appeal and centering. I think it is 3 years from now, the grade on vintage will still be less significant and likely just used as a base for what we are looking for. I feel strongly that you can find many cards at the same grade that look completely different, so the grade becomes less important. My friend Adam of a Vintage Sanctuary says, there is wisdom in the collector community collective. Love it. If the market is hot for a particular card, many collectors tend to be less picky about the condition and eye appeal for the card. However, if the market is weak for a card, many collectors will be very picky and will pass on average or below average eye appeal for the card. There will always be collectors who are willing to pay up for eye appeal within a grade, maybe even a grade level or two. However, there will also be plenty of collectors for whom price is more important consideration. If they can get a card that is off-center with average or below average eye appeal for the grade, for a fraction of the price, they will gleefully buy it. They might even value it more highly than the premium eye appeal copy because well-loved cards are more appealing to them. And my pal Brent says, a lot of great answers here. Will be interesting to see what happens with these sets in the coming years, or something we aren't even thinking of. As far as the question for next week, the number on the slab means less and less to me on vintage cards. Eye appeal is king of everything now for me. On modern cards, however, I do like a nice copy with a high grade. Maybe it's just the fault of somewhere in me, but I just can't help it at this point. Maybe that will slowly change as well. Or maybe that's just what makes something special that isn't special on its own.
All right, some great points from some great people in there. And I think Brent makes a good comment there toward the end where he says, well, for modern, it's a little bit different than it is for vintage. And why would that be? Well, let's just take a step back and let's just remember where we are with cards. We are at a time where the manufacturing of everything is at a level with machinery and automation that didn't even seem possible, 100 years ago. So when you're looking at a card from the T206 set, you're looking at a turn of the century card. You're looking at a card that was made with such inferior paper, cutting techniques, printing techniques. It was so much different than what is happening now. You could line up 10 Joe Burrow cards from the 2022 set that you might not be able to tell the difference. If you moved them around, right? Let's say you took them and you moved them around, could you tell which one was which one? Could you rematch them up to the order that they were in? Probably not. Probably not. And so as a result of that, the only differentiation in a lot of cases between those 2022 Joe Burrow cards would be, what does the heavy magnification show? Is there a little surface indentation? Is there a little bit of a corner nick? Is there a little bit of a roller mark? That would be the only way to differentiate. But imagine if you went back to the 1950s or the 1930s and you took 10 cards of a Babe Ruth and you lined them up and you said, well, put them back in the order from best to worst. You probably could. You probably could. And you say, well, of course you could, Greg. They're older. They have more wear. They have, there's going to be more that are off-center, fewer that are centered. The center is going to be all over the place. The printer mark's going to be all over the place. The registration is going to be all over the place. It's much easier to identify which one is which one with the cards from the 1930s than from the 2020s. And that might be the point. That might be the point. The point is, the reason that the cards from vintage eras care less about the grade than the current era is because The card that got a 4 in the 1930s, the registration might be so bad that the card is blurry. The card could be so off center that part of the image is missing. That's happened all the time, right? There might be so many printer marks on the card or roller marks or ink marks on the card that it's distracting. But the rest of the card might be nice. So because the variance from normal was so big, right? In statistics, they call it the standard deviation. What is the deviation from the average, from the mean? How far from what it's supposed to be could it be? It was from way over here to way over here back in the day. Now, the difference between a really nice burrow at production and a really bad burrow at production is really, really close. So I do understand why someone would say, yes, that 1933 Babe Ruth is a 3, but it's so far off center and the printer marks on his face are driving me nuts. I'd rather have the 1.5 that's well centered with a clear image, even though the corners are severely rounded, versus the card coming off the press right now. It's not going to look that much different. So if you want to differentiate a good copy from a bad copy, some of the more intense, high resolution images and work that they do seems like it might be the only way to tell the difference between a nice one and one that has a little bit of issues. I thought those were great points. I respect all the opinions, and I thought this was an interesting question as we continue to move forward as collectors. Maybe you shouldn't care as much about the grade. Maybe you should care more about the grade. Maybe it just depends on what it is that you're collecting. I thought that all responses were good responses. Personally, I think I care less now than I used to about the grade. To me now, it's about how does it look when I'm holding it, an 18 inches to 2 feet from my face. And if I zoom way in with the Hubble telescope, I don't really care that much if there's something going on in there that was caused by an ant fart, right? For this week's question, I think is an interesting one. I was talking to my buddy Mookie the other day, and we were talking about this topic, and I think that it's worthy of asking to all of you. How much does interest from others affect your interest in a particular card? Are you okay buying cards that others don't like? Or does interest from the rest of the card community affect you? Here's why I think that this is important. Let's say, my guy Mookie, he likes cards that have pinholes because it tells part of the story of the card. Somebody treasured the card. If it's got a pinhole, somebody treasured that card and wanted it on display. That is like evidence of, I like that card. I want to display that card. That's how he sees a pinhole. Other people see a pinhole is the card has been ruined, the card has been altered. Those are two polar opposite opinions. And I understand both of them. When you buy the house, and I'll continue to use this example because when you buy the house on the busy street and it doesn't bother you, but it bothers other people, you're going to get a good deal. You're going to get a really good deal. But when you go to sell it, you won't get market value for it, potentially, because other people are going to be bothered by the busy street. It's sort of that way with cards. I buy pirate cards. They're not super expensive. And the reason they're not super expensive is there aren't a lot of people that want them. But if I decided at some point, I don't want these anymore, I want to sell them, is the value really going to be that much? Of course not, because there aren't a lot of people who want them. So when you buy a 52 mantle, it's expensive because a lot of people want it. But then when you go to sell it, a lot of people want it. So it's a very liquid card. That's what I really think the question plays into here. Some people care if a card is a popular card that other people would want, because if they were ever going to move it or when it eventually gets sold by someone, it will be in higher demand. Rookie cards are in higher demand than non-rookie cards. And that's one of the reasons people want rookie cards, is because they're likely to continue to have a high demand. So how much does the demand from other collectors in the community affect how much you would be interested in a card? Does a card need to have interest from others to have interest from you? Or could you care less? I don't care if I'm the only person on the planet who would ever buy this card. I love it. And you buy the card instead of thinking about what others think. Solely have it revolve around what you think. Where do you fall in that spectrum? Super interested to hear your thoughts on this. Super interested to share back what all of you had to say. So don't forget, down below in the comments, tell me your thoughts on this week's question.